He clutched the envelope with $10,000 in his sweaty hands, running through the narrow streets of Atlanta to save his sick mother. But when those men with cruel looks surrounded the humble house and mocked the fact that a black boy had managed to get so much money, Jamal swallowed hard and began to cry. Jamal sprinted down the narrow street, heart pounding, warm sweat trickling from his forehead. He clutched a single $100 bill in his hand, desperate to reach home before anyone stopped him. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, and the distant hum of traffic blended with muffled shouts from distant corners. Every turn felt like a test of willpower, as if some presence lurked just behind him, waiting for a stumble or pause. He had escaped those older boys only moments ago. They'd cornered him, demanding protection money with cruel smirks and lifted eyebrows, their words dripping with threat. Jamal had handed them a few rumpled bills, not enough to satisfy their greed, then seized a moment of distraction to slip away. He could still hear their frustrated shouts echoing in his mind as he ran. Now, with just over $100 left, all he could think of was his mother's worsening cough and the medicine she desperately needed. At the next intersection, the street narrowed even more, lined by rusted bikes chained to fences and overflowing trash cans. Jamal slowed, breathing hard, and tried to orient himself. Just a few more blocks, he told himself. He imagined his mother's face, her lungs struggling, her voice barely a whisper. The sound of her breathing, labored and shallow, haunted him. He had to find a way to help her. This $100 was a start, but nowhere near enough to buy the treatment she required. Just then, a sudden commotion to his left caught his eye. Papers were whirling through the air like frantic birds, a gust of wind carrying them across the sidewalk. Jamal spotted a man in a sharp gray suit, trying desperately to catch the swirling sheets. A sleek leather briefcase lay open at his feet, spilling documents. The man cursed under his breath, hands grasping wildly as each page seemed determined to escape. Jamal considered ignoring it. Stopping meant risking everything. Those gang members could be right behind him. But something tugged at his conscience. Maybe it was the man's look of honest panic, or the way his polished shoes scuffed against the curb as he stumbled. Against all logic, Jamal lunged forward. He darted between parked cars, nearly slipping into the busy street. A horn blared as he snatched a sheet of paper about to vanish under a car's tire. Clutching the rescued documents to his chest, he sprinted back and thrust them into the man's arms. The man's eyes widened. They were lined with fine creases, and there was a blend of surprise and relief etched into his neatly groomed features. "Thank you," the stranger managed, catching his breath. He adjusted his suit jacket and eyed Jamal curiously. "You risked your life for these papers. Why?" His voice was calm, with a hint of something refined, perhaps wealth or authority. Jamal shrugged, still panting. He wasn't used to such direct questions from strangers in fancy suits. "You looked like you needed help. That's all," he said simply, rubbing a hand over his sweaty brow. He realized how small he must seem to this well-dressed man. A skinny kid in worn sneakers, clothes slightly too big, hands still wrapped tightly around that $100 bill. The man straightened, smoothing his jacket. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Jamal," he replied, voice guarded. The man nodded thoughtfully. "I'm Edward," he said. "Mr. Edward to most people, I suppose, but never mind that. Why were you in such a hurry?" Jamal hesitated. Should he trust this stranger? He could still feel the tension lingering in the air. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting those older boys to appear at any moment. But Edward's gaze was steady, encouraging. Carefully, Jamal explained about his mother's illness, the struggle to get her proper treatment, and the constant threats lurking in the neighborhood. He avoided going into too much detail, but it was enough to make Edward frown, his eyes narrowing with concern. "I see," Edward said at last. "That's a grave situation. No child should have to face such danger just to care for a loved one. He paused, looking down the block as if searching for answers in the crumbling brick facades. I might be able to help you, Jamal. Provide you with some resources, perhaps connections to doctors. Before he could finish, heavy footsteps thundered at the corner. 3 older teens emerged, crude knives glittering in their hands. Their faces were twisted in malice, eyes hungry for whatever they could extract. Jamal recognized them immediately, the same bullies he'd just escaped. He felt his stomach knot up as they glanced from him to Edward, sizing them both up. Edward stepped forward, placing himself partially in front of Jamal. "Leave the boy alone," he said quietly, holding up a hand in a calm yet firm gesture. The gang members sneered. One of them, taller than the others, lifted his chin. "He owes us," he said, voice rough and proud. "We don't care who you are. Hand over the money." Jamal's heart hammered. He'd never been in a direct confrontation with someone who appeared so confident, so well connected, and this time he had no easy escape route. Despite his fear, he moved closer to Edward, shoulders tense. For a moment, no one moved. Then the gang surged forward. The fight was swift and messy. Jamal, frightened but desperate, grabbed Edward's arm and yanked him behind a wooden crate leaning against a graffiti-covered wall. One of the teens lunged with a blade, only to stumble over a broken handcart that Jamal kicked into his path. Another swung at Edward, who dodged clumsily, snatching a metal pipe from the ground and brandishing it. The clank of metal against pavement and the shouts of surprise filled the alleyway. Jamal ducked a wild swing, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear. He knocked one assailant's arm aside, pushing him off balance. This gave Edward a chance to swing the pipe, scattering them like startled pigeons. The teens, shocked by the resistance, exchanged a furious glare. They hadn't expected a boy and a man in a suit to fight back so determinedly. With curses and threats, they retreated, vowing to return. Their footsteps faded around the corner, leaving Jamal and Edward breathing hard in the dusty light. Jamal's hands trembled slightly. He had never been more terrified, yet he refused to let it show. Edward lowered the pipe, adjusting his tie. He looked at Jamal as if seeing him anew. "You've got spirit, kid," he said, forcing a small smile. "I meant what I said. I will help you. Expect a visit tomorrow. I'll bring something that might change your situation." He glanced around, still wary. "But be careful, Jamal. These streets aren't safe. Keep your head down." Jamal nodded, unsure how to feel. Gratitude battled with lingering anxiety. He clutched the $100 bill tighter, as if it were his lifeline. Edward stepped away, leaving Jamal alone as dusk settled in. The boy hurried home, heart still rattling in his chest. He pushed open the chipped wooden door and entered the cramped living space. The smell of old blankets and stale air enveloped him. He could hear his mother coughing softly from the next room, each breath sounding labored and weak. Jamal approached a broken window to let in some fresh air. As he peered outside, his eyes caught a dark shape parked across the street. His heart froze. It was that same black car, its tinted windows reflecting the faint streetlights. A figure sat inside, barely visible in the gloom, but enough for Jamal to see the outline of a face watching him. The stranger raised something, a thick envelope. The man stared directly at Jamal, as if acknowledging the silent tension between them. A chill slid down Jamal's spine. He backed away from the window, blood pounding in his ears. He thought about Edward's promise, the bullies, the fight, and now this mysterious watcher. Nothing made sense. All he knew was that tomorrow could bring salvation, or even greater danger. But he had to hope. He had to believe that something good might come of this. As Jamal steps inside, he hears his mother's cough, and peering through the cracked window, he spots that same black car with an unfamiliar man inside, holding a thick envelope and staring straight at him. Jamal woke to a dawn sky just starting to lighten, the first pale blues pushing back against the night. He rubbed his eyes and forced himself out of bed, careful not to disturb the quiet house. It had been a long, restless night after the strange encounter and the ominous sight of that black car parked outside. His mother's soft coughs reached his ears as he stepped into the cramped living room, and he paused, listening to her breathing. The sound rattled in her chest, tugging at his heart. They had no time to waste. He needed medicine, a proper doctor, anything to stabilize her weakening lungs. He peered through the cracked front window, expecting to see that car again, but for now, the street was empty. The sky brightened over the old rooftops, and he tried to push the fear out of his mind. He had to focus on surviving this day. Just as the sun rose above the crumbling brick buildings, a long white limousine rolled quietly up the block. The gleam of its paint and its tinted windows looked out of place in Jamal's worn neighborhood. He tensed, stepping onto the porch with cautious curiosity. The car halted, and after a brief pause, the driver's door swung open, a uniformed chauffeur stepping out to open the passenger door. Mr. Edward emerged, smoothing the front of his suit. In the early light, he looked poised and collected, as if he belonged in a distant world of polished offices and glass towers. Spotting Jamal, he nodded briskly and crossed the cracked sidewalk to meet him. "I told you I'd come," Edward said, voice low and calm. He produced a thick envelope from his jacket pocket and pressed it into Jamal's hand. "This should help your mother. It's $10,000. Get her the treatment she needs." Jamal's eyes widened, his fingers curling protectively around the envelope, as if it might vanish. He had never held that much money in his life. The weight of it stunned him. He wanted to say something, to thank Edward or to ask why he was being so generous, but his words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he managed. Edward studied him for a moment, the hint of a sympathetic crease forming between his brows. "Take care, Jamal," he said. "The streets are dangerous. I have a meeting, but I'll check back soon." Jamal's heart fluttered. This was a lifeline. With this money, he could buy proper medication, maybe even arrange for a real doctor. But as he turned toward the house, he was jolted by a sudden crash. A stone smashed through the back window, glass scattering onto the worn carpet inside. Jamal jumped, spinning around, heart pounding. He rushed back through the door, into the tiny living space, and found a jagged hole in the rear window. On the floor lay a rock with a paper tied around it. His hands shook as he knelt and picked it up. Slowly he unwrapped the note and read the scrawled message. "This doesn't belong to you." Jamal's throat tightened. He glanced at his mother's door. Thankfully, she hadn't woken. He swallowed hard, trying to calm the rush of panic. He could still hear Edward's footsteps outside, so he hurried to the front porch, clutching the note. Edward looked alarmed when Jamal showed him the message. "I had no idea you were dealing with people like this," Edward said quietly. His voice carried a hint of urgency. "I can arrange for protection, or at least put you in touch with someone at a decent hospital who won't ask too many questions." Jamal pressed his lips together. It felt like every blessing came hand in hand with a curse. He thought about last night, the black car and the man inside. Now a message of intimidation had landed right in his home. "I don't know who they are," Jamal said, voice trembling with frustration. "These streets. Everyone wants something. They see a kid with money and think they can take it." Edward's eyes flicked up and down the empty block. "I must go, but I won't abandon you. Keep the money hidden. Find a doctor today, understand? I'll return as soon as I can." Jamal nodded, chest tight. He watched as Edward headed back to the limousine. The engine purred softly. Then the car slipped away into the dawn, leaving Jamal alone once more. He closed the door carefully and stepped into the dim interior, feeling the tension buzzing in his bones. He hurried to his mother's room. She lay half awake, flushed with fever. Jamal pulled a thin blanket up to her chin and whispered that he was working on something to help her, something real this time. Her eyes fluttered in acknowledgement, too weak to form words. He pressed a gentle hand on her forehead, feeling the warmth, and promised himself he would not fail her. In the next hour, he counted and recounted the bills in the envelope, tucking them deep into an old backpack that he stashed behind a loose board in the kitchen wall. His ears stayed tuned for the slightest noise outside, but for now nothing stirred. He paced the small rooms, thinking through his options. He needed to move fast. The local clinic was shady at best, and the doctors there demanded payment up front. But he had no other choice. He'd pay what they asked, even overpay if that's what it took. If he could just get some antibiotics, maybe his mother would have a fighting chance. Suddenly, a soft crunch of footsteps drew him to the window. He peered out and spotted a figure across the street, leaning casually against a graffiti-tagged wall. The man wore a dark jacket, his face partially in shadow, but Jamal recognized the posture. Someone watching, waiting for him to leave the house. Jamal's stomach twisted. He pulled back from the window pane, careful not to reveal himself. Time ticked by painfully. The morning sun was now fully risen, painting the alleyways and chipped paint of old storefronts in a warm, golden light. Yet despite the brightness, the air felt heavy with threat. Jamal tried to gather courage, reminding himself of the money tucked away. He had a way forward now. No matter who lurked outside, he wouldn't give up. He took a moment to breathe, remembering Edward's offer and his strange calm. Maybe Edward's help really could break through the web of intimidation tangled around them. But Edward was gone now, and Jamal needed to stand on his own 2 feet, at least until he had a doctor's note or medication in hand. He decided to try the clinic after all. Pay them enough so they wouldn't ask questions. Maybe they'd at least prescribe something stronger than the useless over-the-counter pills he'd been scraping together. Before he left, he checked on his mother again. Her breathing was shallower, a faint wheeze that set his nerves on edge. He had to hurry. With one last look at the backpack of money, safely hidden away, he stepped outside. The brightness made him squint. The figure who'd been lurking across the street was gone now, or maybe he'd never been there at all. Jamal tried to calm himself. He had the resources. He would find a way. Still, as he stood on the porch, something gnawed at him. It felt like everything he did was being observed by silent eyes. He looked down the street and froze. At the far end, partially obscured by a battered mailbox, was that same black car he'd seen last night. It sat still, its windows tinted dark. This time, though, Jamal could make out 2 silhouettes inside, both facing his direction. They weren't even trying to hide it now. They were staring directly at his home, as if waiting for him to make his next move. Jamal hears the distant growl of an engine, and once again sees that black car at the end of the street, this time with 2 men staring straight at his house. Jamal stood on the curb, backpack heavy with money pressed tight against his back, shoulders tense as he scanned the quiet morning street. His mother had grown weaker overnight. He couldn't afford any more delays. The local clinic was only a few blocks away, but each step felt like a risk. He kept glancing over his shoulder, uneasy about that black car and the men who'd made it clear they were watching his every move. The small public clinic sat wedged between a boarded-up storefront and a rundown barbershop. Its peeling paint and flickering neon sign didn't inspire confidence, but Jamal had to try. He pushed the door open and stepped into a cramped waiting area that smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. A handful of people milled about, coughing softly, flipping through old magazines. The receptionist glanced up, her expression flat and uninterested. "Name?" she asked, not bothering to hide her impatience. "Jamal," he said quietly. "I'm here to buy medicine for my mother. She's very sick." The receptionist let out a small sigh. "We don't just hand out medication," she said. "We need to see the patient, know her condition. Do you have money, insurance?" Jamal reached into his jacket and pulled out a few crisp $100 bills. "I have money," he said, voice low. "I can pay whatever it costs. I just need antibiotics, something strong." Her eyes narrowed, flicking from the bills to Jamal's face. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "A kid like you walking in here with this kind of cash? We'll have to talk to a doctor about this." She gestured toward a cramped hallway. Jamal followed nervously, feeling every stair in the waiting room burning into his back. The receptionist led him to a small examination room where a doctor stood behind a cluttered desk. The doctor had tired eyes, hollow cheeks, and a thin mustache. He barely looked at Jamal before speaking. "What exactly do you need?" the doctor asked, rifling through paperwork without waiting for an answer. His tone was cold, almost mechanical. "My mother's lungs are failing," Jamal said. "She's coughing blood sometimes, can't breathe well. I need antibiotics, something that will help until I can get a real specialist." The doctor glanced at the bills in Jamal's hand. He tapped his pen on the desk. "I don't do charity," he said flatly, "and these medicines aren't cheap. Before I write anything, I need payment up front, no exceptions." Jamal swallowed hard, stepping forward to place several $100 bills on the desk. He prayed it would be enough. The doctor lifted one of the bills to the light, inspecting it, then frowned as if offended. "Where did you get this kind of money?" he asked. Jamal felt his heart skip. He forced himself to stay calm. "I got it from a man who wants to help," he said. "My mom's sick. That's all you need to know." The doctor smirked, exchanging a quick, knowing glance with the receptionist. He seemed more interested in Jamal's story than his health concerns. "Wait here," the doctor said, pocketing the bills. "I'll see what I can do." As the doctor left, a nurse approached quietly, her face creased with sympathy. She leaned close to Jamal, whispering so softly he could barely hear. "Be careful," she said. "This place isn't what it seems. The head of the clinic, he's got dealings, people from the streets. They might want a cut of whatever you have." Jamal's stomach twisted. That explained the suspicious looks, the uneasy atmosphere. He had just placed himself in the middle of something bigger, something rotten. The doctor took too long to return, and when he finally did, he had no prescription in hand. "We can't help you without more information," the doctor said with a shrug. "Bring your mother in. Maybe then we'll consider prescribing something." His eyes lingered on the money he'd tucked away, as if daring Jamal to protest. Jamal's blood boiled. They were playing games, stalling on purpose. He could almost feel the trap closing in around him. Without a word, he turned and left, heart pounding with frustration and fury. The receptionist didn't even look up as he passed. Outside, the light was harsher, making him squint. He knew he had to find another way. Maybe a pharmacy nearby would sell something over the counter, something stronger than the weak meds he'd used before. He headed for a small pharmacy he remembered, located just behind the clinic, down a dim alley strewn with broken crates and battered trash cans. The pharmacy's interior was cramped and dimly lit. Shelves overflowed with cardboard boxes, and a musty smell lingered in the air. A middle-aged pharmacist with kind eyes and a worn apron looked up when Jamal entered. "How can I help you, son?" he asked. Jamal placed a few bills on the counter, voice hushed and desperate. "I need antibiotics for my mother. She's very sick. I don't have a prescription, but I can pay." "Please." Before the pharmacist could answer, a sudden weight slammed into Jamal's shoulder. A hooded figure lunged out of the shadows, snatching at his hand. Jamal stumbled back, heart hammering as he realized the attacker was going straight for the envelope of money he'd stashed inside his jacket. "Give it here!" The hooded man hissed, brandishing a knife that glinted in the pharmacy's faint light. Jamal struggled, refusing to let go. He twisted and kicked, sending a shelf of bandages crashing to the floor. The pharmacist shouted in surprise, grabbing a wooden cane from behind the counter. Without hesitation, he swung it at the attacker's arm, knocking the knife aside. The hooded figure cursed, staggering back. In that brief moment, Jamal yanked the envelope free of the man's grip and sprinted toward the door, heart in his throat. He could still hear the pharmacist yelling behind him, could still feel the rushing adrenaline pumping through his veins. The attacker shouted threats, but by the time Jamal reached the street, the hooded man had melted into the alley's darkness. Jamal fled through twisting lanes, lungs burning, until he reached the familiar sight of his house. Sweat dripped down his face and every muscle ached. He clutched the money harder, relieved it was still his. But relief was short-lived. Inside, his mother was lying in bed, weaker than before, her breath rattling ominously. The fear of losing her flared bright and painful. He set the envelope down gently and knelt beside her, whispering reassurance, though he wasn't sure how much she understood. He wanted to cry, to curse this entire situation. Instead, he smoothed her blanket and forced himself to think clearer, to find another solution. A faint voice drifted in from outside. Curious, Jamal moved quietly to the door and peered through a thin gap. There, under a weak street lamp at the far corner, he saw a familiar profile. Mr. Edward, sharply dressed as always. But Edward wasn't alone. He was in a heated discussion with a thin man in a cheap suit. Jamal pressed his ear to the wood, straining to catch their words. "You promised a clean operation," the thin man snarled, voice carrying through the still air. "Now that boy is getting in the way of the deal. You need to handle this." Edward stiffened, glancing over his shoulder as if sensing eyes upon him. As he peers through the crack in the door, Jamal sees Mr. Edward's silhouette at the corner, arguing with a thin man in a cheap suit who complains about the boy getting in the way of the deal. Jamal gripped the frame of the door, pressing his ear close enough to catch every word drifting through the still night air. Beyond the dim glow of a distant street lamp, Mr. Edward stood at the corner, speaking to the thin man in the cheap suit. Their tones were hushed, urgent, and charged with a tension that made the hairs on Jamal's neck rise. The thin man jabbed a finger at Edward's chest, complaining about the boy interfering, and warning that this wasn't supposed to happen. Edward nodded curtly, trying to maintain a calm front, but his jaw clenched, and his eyes kept darting toward Jamal's direction. Jamal stepped back and shut the door quietly, heart pounding. Edward was involved with these dangerous people. No question now. The man who had handed him thousands of dollars and promised help was part of something twisted. Yet, he might still be Jamal's only chance. After all, Edward said he'd find a real doctor, arrange for something better. Jamal's mother needed care right away. He'd have to confront Edward, find out what he really intended, and decide if the risk was worth taking. The next morning, a heavy gloom shrouded the neighborhood. Clouds hung low and a soft drizzle slicked the cracked pavement. Jamal waited near his door, hoping Edward would appear again, that he'd keep his word and show up with genuine help. He rehearsed what he would say, anger simmering beneath his fear. How dare Edward play both sides? He didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, the now familiar gleam of a white limousine drifted into view, engine humming softly. Jamal's heart fluttered. He stepped onto the porch as Edward climbed out, holding an umbrella, his polished shoes reflecting the weak daylight. "Jamal," Edward said quietly, looking him over. "We need to move quickly. I've arranged for your mother to be taken to a better hospital, one where they won't question the source of payment." Jamal crossed his arms, lifting his chin. "I saw you last night," he said. "You were talking to that man. He said I was getting in the way. What's going on?" Edward stiffened slightly, adjusting the collar of his suit. "You misunderstood," he replied. "These streets are full of rumors and half-truths. The man you saw is a business associate. He's upset because I've diverted some resources to help you. That's all." His voice was calm, but there was a tightness in his expression that made Jamal uneasy. Still, Jamal had no real choice. His mother's condition was worsening. He looked back through the open door, saw her lying pale and silent on the makeshift bed. He couldn't waste time unraveling all the lies. "I'll trust you for now," Jamal said, voice low. "But don't think I'm blind. If something goes wrong, I'll know who to blame." Edward didn't flinch. He tipped his head in acknowledgement. "Then let's not waste a second. Bring your mother. I've made arrangements." Jamal bit his lip. He carefully lifted his mother, who was lighter than she had ever been. Her breath came in shallow wheezes. She tried to open her eyes, but could barely manage a weak flutter. He carried her out to the limousine, each step measured and tense. The door swung open, revealing a spacious interior with cream-colored leather seats and tinted windows. It felt like stepping into another world, foreign and far removed from the cluttered, humble rooms of his home. Edward and Jamal eased her onto the back seat. The quiet hum of the air conditioning, the soft scent of polished leather, none of it felt real. Jamal settled beside his mother, holding her hand, while Edward sat opposite, crossing one leg over the other. The driver shut the door, and the limo eased smoothly into the street. "I've arranged a doctor at a better hospital," Edward said, meeting Jamal's eyes. "He'll begin treatment, help stabilize her. Then we can see about getting the specialized help she needs." Jamal forced a nod, but he could feel the weight of suspicion pressing down. He watched the blurred scenery pass by. Weathered buildings, old shops, narrow alleys. Edward looked calm, too calm. Jamal's mind flicked back to the conversation he overheard. If Edward was lying now, what would that mean for his mother's safety? He squeezed her hand gently, as if to reassure himself that he had no other choice. Rain trickled down the tinted windows, distorting the view. The engine's gentle purr was the only sound, until Jamal finally spoke. "If this doctor you found is real," he said quietly, "I'll pay whatever it costs. I have money, good money. I won't ask questions, but I need results." Edward's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Of course. We'll handle everything. Your mother will get the care she deserves." He offered a thin smile, though his eyes remained distant, as if calculating something. Minutes passed. Jamal tried to calm his racing thoughts and focused on his mother's breathing. He wished the streets would pass faster, that they'd already be at the hospital. The tension grew with each block, each corner turned. He kept glancing at Edward, who stared out the window or tapped at his phone, making brief calls in hushed tones. Jamal couldn't catch every word, but it sounded like Edward was confirming appointments, directing staff, issuing orders. As the limo turned onto a wider avenue, Jamal dared to hope that maybe Edward's deal was genuine. Maybe he had judged him too harshly. But something nagged at him, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. Instinctively, he glanced through the rear window. His stomach dropped. He could see it there just behind them, the black car moving quietly in the rain, headlights off. They were following again, just as they had watched his house. Jamal's heartbeat hammered in his ears. He pressed closer to the window, making sure he wasn't mistaken. It was unmistakable. Same dark paint, same tinted windows, trailing them at a distance that was too close to be a coincidence. He turned back to Edward, who was engrossed in his phone, pretending not to notice. Fear and anger swirled inside Jamal. If Edward knew about these men, why wasn't he doing something? Was he luring Jamal into some trap? He felt his mother's hand slacken his, her breathing shallow and uneven. He couldn't panic now. He had to stay calm, think this through. Maybe the doctor was real, and these men were just lurking, waiting for their chance. Or maybe this was all part of a larger plan, one he couldn't yet understand. Jamal swallowed hard and tried to steady his voice. "We're being followed," he said, looking Edward dead in the eye. "That black car is behind us." Edward raised his gaze slowly, his face a careful mask. "Don't worry about them," he said. "I've taken precautions." His words offered no comfort. Jamal looked back at the black car, trailing them through the haze of rain, silent and persistent. Time felt suspended as the limo rolled through the slick streets, carrying him and his mother toward an uncertain future. As the limousine pulls away, Jamal notices in the rearview mirror the black car following them in silence, its headlights off. By the time the limousine pulled into the hospital's driveway, a light drizzle had turned into a steady rain. Water pooled in the cracked pavement, and distant sirens pulsed somewhere beyond the tall brick walls. Jamal's heart sank as he noticed the black car gliding quietly up the block, parking a short distance away. He could see it through the tinted window, its occupants making no move to approach, but keeping a watchful vigil. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step he took was being measured, each decision noted. The limo's door swung open, and Jamal stepped out first, gripping his mother's hand. She lay half-conscious, feverish, on the seat behind him. Edward leaned in and helped guide her onto a rolling gurney that a waiting attendant had brought. The hospital building rose before them, a squat structure with aging windows and peeling paint. Supposedly this place was better than the last, but from where Jamal stood, it didn't look like salvation. It looked like yet another gamble. Inside, the reception area was bathed in harsh fluorescent light. A young receptionist with heavy eyeliner and a bored expression eyed the wad of cash Jamal offered. He needed immediate care. He'd pay whatever they wanted. But her eyebrows shot up, suspicious as she flipped through the crisp bills. Jamal's skin prickled under her gaze. He overheard two nurses whispering by a supply cart nearby. "Edward's scheme?" one asked quietly, shooting a glance at Jamal. "I heard he was funneling money through these wards." The other nurse hushed her, noticing the boy's presence. They fell silent as Jamal stepped closer, but when he tried to approach, the door to a nearby office slammed shut, muffling further conversation. Jamal swallowed hard. Scheme. Money funneling. He caught sight of Edward strolling down a corridor, disappearing around a corner as if drawn by some urgent errand. Jamal called out, "Edward!" But the man didn't turn. Left alone, he tried to catch a passing doctor's attention, but the man brushed him off with a curt nod, refusing to meet his eyes. He wheeled his mother's gurney through the hall, searching for any sign of help. Her fever had spiked, leaving her trembling under the thin hospital blanket. Jamal's heart twisted painfully at the sight of her hollow cheeks, her eyes fluttering in delirium. He needed antibiotics, an oxygen mask, a real specialist. Anything more than these suspicious stares and half-whispered rumors. An older doctor in a stained coat passed by, and Jamal rushed forward. "My mother needs help," he said, voice tight with desperation. "We have money, all right? I can pay. Just find a specialist." The doctor barely paused, merely shook his head. "Which specialist?" he asked, voice cold. "We don't treat patients without a proper reference and confirmed funds. Go talk to accounts, kid." Then he walked off, leaving Jamal gaping, anger mixing with despair. A soft voice called him from behind. He turned to see a young nurse with kind, worried eyes. She took a quick glance over her shoulder before leaning in. "They're giving you the runaround," she whispered. "If you want help, you need someone who can speak on your behalf. Without that, they'll keep stalling." She looked genuinely sorry, biting her lip as she stepped back. "Try a different hospital, a different approach. Something here isn't right." Jamal nodded numbly. Of course something wasn't right. He could almost taste the tension in the air, as if everyone here was playing a part in some hidden drama. He pressed his back against a cold tile wall, running a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. He thought of Edward's promises, the black car's silent pursuit, and the strange whispers he'd caught. Nothing matched the image of straightforward help he had hoped for. Somewhere down the hall he heard hurried footsteps. A staff member muttered into a phone, voice hushed and urgent, as if delivering a report. Jamal caught only fragments. "The boy is here." waiting, not cooperating. He gritted his teeth. This was no place of healing. It felt more like a trap. He stepped into another corridor, pushing the gurney himself, ignoring the hostile stares of a doctor who blocked his path. The man looked at his watch and shook his head. No ID, no confirmed transfer, no treatment. Move aside, he said, as if Jamal and his mother were a minor inconvenience. Jamal's grip on the gurney's handle tightened. He glanced down at his mother's face, drawn and pale, her breathing shaky. They were wasting precious time. He couldn't let her fade away in this place. It didn't matter that he had money. These people wanted more than cash. They wanted control, references, a nod from Edward or whoever pulled the strings in these hallways. Sweat beaded on Jamal's forehead. He tried to keep calm, but he could feel panic tightening his chest. His mother's hand felt warmer than ever, fever blazing beneath her skin. He had to make a choice. Stay here and keep begging for help that wouldn't come, or leave and search for someplace else, someone who would actually listen and treat her with the dignity she deserved. He glanced out a narrow window and saw gray rain spattering the glass. His reflection stared back, eyes full of worry and anger. He needed to trust his instincts. Edward had led him here, but Edward was nowhere to be found now. No matter how desperate Jamal was, he had to face the truth. These people would not help him. They were too tangled up in whatever game Edward and that thin man had set into motion. With trembling resolve, he turned the gurney toward the exit. He didn't know where he would go, but anywhere had to be better than this. Step by step, he pushed his mother through the corridor, ignoring the murmurs and the pointed stairs. He slipped through a side door, pushing hard against the stiff metal bar until a blast of damp, chilly air met them outside. The alley behind the hospital smelled of wet concrete and old trash. Jamal blinked at the sudden gloom and swiped rainwater from his eyes. He moved carefully, trying to shield his mother from the weather as best he could. Then he saw a figure waiting near a lamppost, an umbrella tilted at a sharp angle. A thin man, wearing a cheap suit that clung uncomfortably to his frame in the drizzle. The man's lips curved into a knowing smirk as their eyes met. Jamal froze. This had to be the one he'd seen before, the one who had complained to Edward about the boy getting in the way. The man looked far too pleased to see him now, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. As Jamal pushes the gurney into the rainy alley, he finds the thin man in the cheap suit, waiting with a calculated smile, as if he knew every move Jamal would make. Jamal froze, the rain dripping off his hood and onto the gurney's metal frame. His heart thudded as he faced the thin man in the cheap suit, waiting beneath the weak alley lamplight. The man stood there with unsettling calm, one hand in his pocket, the other holding an umbrella angled just enough to keep his face partially in shadow. "You're in a hurry," the man said, voice smooth and low as if they were old acquaintances. "Leaving the hospital so soon? Did they fail to meet your expectations?" He cast a glance at Jamal's mother, who lay under a damp blanket, fever still burning in her cheeks. Jamal clenched his jaw. "Get out of my way," he said quietly, forcing steel into his voice. The alley's smell of wet concrete and rot pressed in on him, but he refused to show fear. He needed to find real help, someplace far from this tangled web of corruption and double talk. The thin man stepped aside with an elegant sweep of his umbrella. "I'm not stopping you," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm just curious if you know where you're going. Wandering around in the rain with a dying woman looks a bit desperate." Jamal ignored him and pushed the gurney forward, wheels squeaking as they rolled over puddles. The man followed at a leisurely pace, each footstep echoing in the narrow space. A shiver of unease crawled up Jamal's spine. He had to vanish from this place, find a better path. Then he remembered something. A glimpse of a document he'd once seen tucked into Edward's portfolio. Among those pages flapping in the wind back when they met, there was something about a community hospital under construction. a future project with volunteer staff. If it was still underway, maybe he could find someone honest, someone who cared more about saving lives than about money or power. Keeping his head down, Jamal turned left at the end of the alley, forcing himself to trust his memory. If he was right, the construction site wasn't far. He heard the thin man chuckle softly behind him, but the footsteps did not follow him past the corner. Jamal didn't dare look back. Rain blurred the lines of the street. He passed boarded-up shops and trash-strewn corners, his mother's breathing the only guide he truly cared about. She was so weak now, barely conscious. Each rasping breath tore at him, fueling his determination to find help. After several blocks, he spotted something that looked promising. Bright floodlights illuminating a skeletal metal framework, half-built walls, and stacks of lumber covered by tarps. It must have been the community hospital site. Workers might still be around, or maybe a field medic. If luck was on his side, he could find someone with a shred of compassion. He pushed the gurney across muddy ground, weaving between parked trucks and piles of cement bags. The rain turned the place into a slick mess, and he nearly slipped. A small portable trailer stood near the back, its door slightly ajar, a light glowing inside. Jamal aimed for it, praying for mercy. As he approached, he saw a woman in a white coat emerge, holding a clipboard. She looked up, surprised at the sight of them. She was around 40, with gentle eyes and dark curls escaping her hood. When she spoke, her voice was warm and firm. "What's going on here?" Jamal's voice cracked. "My mother's dying. I need help. Please, I can pay." The woman hurried forward, pushing aside a stray piece of tarp. "Money doesn't matter right now," she said, kneeling beside the gurney to feel his mother's forehead. "I'm Dr. Simone. We were supposed to have a proper clinic after construction, but we've got a small medical station here for injured workers. It's not much, but I'll do what I can." Jamal nearly wept with relief. Finally, someone who cared. Dr. Simone guided him into the makeshift trailer, where a small cot and a few cabinets of supplies waited. She examined his mother, checking her pulse, her breathing, her fever. The doctor's brow furrowed with concern as she administered basic medication, started an IV drip of fluids. "She's critical," Dr. Simone said softly. "We need to get her proper antibiotics and a stable environment. This is only a stopgap." Jamal nodded, wiping rain from his eyes. "Just help her live through the night. I'll find a way to get the proper care," he promised. He looked around the trailer, no guards with suspicious stares, no one asking where the money came from. Just workers moving lumber, pipes, and scaffolding in the background, trying to make something good in a place starved of it. Dr. Simone worked with steady hands, offering words of reassurance as she did what she could. Jamal dared to hope again. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe he could make deals with honest people, sidestep Edward's twisted network. A sudden shout outside snapped him back to reality. He rushed to the open door and saw a group of men approaching, silhouetted against the floodlights, their voices carrying a dark edge. Jamal recognized their stance, their swagger. They were no strangers. These were Leon's men, the same ones who'd haunted him since he got the money. He spotted knives glinting, heavy boots sloshing in the mud. Leon stepped forward, a grin cutting across his narrow face. His suit was cheap, but he wore it with an air of grim confidence. "So this is where you ran off to," he said, voice echoing across the construction site. Behind him, a few workers retreated nervously, unsure whether to intervene. Jamal stepped outside, trying to block their view of his mother and Dr. Simone. "Leave us alone," he warned, fists clenched. "I don't care what you think I owe. I'm not giving you anything." Leon chuckled. "I'm not here to bargain, kid. That envelope belongs to us. Hand over whatever cash you have left, or things get ugly." His men spread out, forming a half circle. In the background, Dr. Simone appeared in the trailer's doorway, eyes wide with alarm. Jamal's heart hammered, He had courage, sure, but these thugs were armed and he had no real protection. The workers looked hesitant, clutching metal pipes or planks of wood, but too unsure to charge in. Dr. Simone's presence was a comfort, but she couldn't fight off a gang. Jamal needed a miracle. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, echoing sharply against the metal beams and half-built walls. Everyone froze. Through the haze of rain and shock, Jamal spotted a familiar figure stepping into the light. Mr. Edward. He held a pistol aloft, smoke curling from its barrel, and fixed Jamal with a stare so cold it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As a gunshot echoes through the air, Mr. Edward suddenly steps forward, fixing Jamal with a cold stare, as if he has taken the other side. Jamal's throat tightened as the echo of the gunshot faded into the dripping silence. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Mr. Edward, the man who had once promised him help and hope, now stood beside Leon's men, his polished shoes sinking into the muddy ground, a pistol still raised as if it were a natural extension of his arm. The construction site lights cast harsh shadows, distorting his once kind features into something unreadable and grim. Dr. Simone hovered at the trailer's doorway behind Jamal, her eyes wide with shock. She'd helped stabilize his mother only moments before, and now found herself caught in the middle of a standoff that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with greed and betrayal. Workers edged away, unsure whether to intervene or run. Leon smirked, pleased to see Edward's arrival. "Took you long enough," he said, voice echoing over dripping tarps and metal beams. "Thought you might leave me to handle this mess by myself." Edward shot him a look of annoyance before focusing on Jamal. "Hand over the money, kid," he said, voice surprisingly calm. "You heard Leon. We can't afford any more delays. The cops are sniffing around. We need those funds now." Jamal's fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. He remembered the day he'd saved Edward's briefcase, the promise of help, the sealed envelope with enough money to spark a glimmer of hope. All of it had been a lie, a cover to disguise their dirty dealings. Now Edward wanted that money back, even if it meant leaving Jamal and his mother to fend for themselves. "Why?" Jamal's voice shook with anger. "Why play me like that? I trusted you." Edward's expression hardened. "Because we needed a distraction. Someone to look like a charity case while we moved funds around. That hospital project, just a front for laundering money. When you got caught up in it, I figured it was perfect. Handing you some cash looked good if anyone asked questions. Now we need that money returned to keep certain people quiet." Jamal's heart burned with a mix of rage and desperation. He looked back at Dr. Simone, who tightened her grip on the doorframe, silently pleading for him not to do anything foolish. His mother lay inside, weak and trembling, barely holding on. Jamal realized that to Edward and Leon, she was nothing more than a piece in their elaborate game. Leon stepped forward, clicking his tongue in annoyance. "Come on, kid. Don't make this harder. We know you still have some real bills left. Just hand them over, and we'll pretend none of this ever happened." Jamal felt trapped. He had some of the money tucked away, enough to start proper treatment if he could find a reliable doctor. If he gave it up now, he'd have nothing. But if he refused, these men might hurt Dr. Simone, or worse, finish off whatever chance his mother had at survival. He tried to stall. "I don't have it on me," he said. I left it somewhere safe." Edward narrowed his eyes. "I'm not in the mood for lies. You think I don't know your every move? Hand it over." A sharp tension rose in the air, the workers hovering uncertainly, looking to each other for cues. One of them, a burly man in a hard hat, finally stepped forward, gripping a wooden plank. "Hey, this is a construction site, not a battlefield. Take your business elsewhere." Leon laughed, stepping toward the brave worker, knife gleaming. "You want to play hero?" he said, voice mocking. "I'm not sure that ends well for you." Jamal realized things were spiraling fast. He had to act. Using the sudden distraction, he reached into his jacket, pretending to retrieve the envelope. Instead, he pulled out a handful of dirty bills, mostly torn scraps and fakes he'd discovered in the envelope after the chaos, and held them up. "This is what's left," he said, holding the damp, crumpled bills high. "It's worthless. Half of it's fake. You gave me money that wasn't even all real." Edward's jaw tightened in frustration. "That's impossible. We kept half real, half fake to confuse thieves. There has to be some good currency left. Hand it all over." Jamal spread the bills in his shaking hand, letting a few flutter to the muddy ground. "See for yourself," he said, voice bitter. "You played me, but I learned a few tricks. I separated the real money from the fake when I realized something was off. You want it, you'll have to dig deeper." Leon's face twisted in fury. Without warning, he lunged forward, knife drawn, as if to cut down this insolent kid who dared to stand between him and his profits. Jamal stumbled back, heart racing, kicking up a spray of mud as he tried to keep distance. The workers saw their chance. 2 of them rushed in from the sides, brandishing tools and pipes to fend off Leon's men. A chaotic melee erupted under the floodlights. Sparks flew as metal struck metal, and shouts ricocheted off unfinished walls. Dr. Simone ducked inside the trailer, covering Jamal's mother with her body to protect her from the flying debris. Jamal seized a loose length of rebar, gritting his teeth, determined not to let them near his mother. Edward moved behind Leon's men, shouting commands, struggling to maintain control. But the unexpected resistance from the workers threw them off. Leon snarled as he dodged a swinging pipe, the grin wiped clean from his face. Jamal realized he had to act fast. He couldn't hold these men back forever. Maybe he could secure his mother's safety first. Spotting an opening, he slipped behind a stack of lumber and circled toward the trailer, where Dr. Simone guarded his mother. Mud sucked at his shoes, rain prickled his skin, and all around him, the sounds of fighting blurred into a frantic din. He reached the trailer door, breath coming in ragged gasps. "Doctor," he hissed, "we need to get her out of here. Can you help me carry her somewhere safer?" Dr. Simone nodded, eyes blazing with resolve. "There's a service entrance behind the scaffolding. It leads to a side street. If we're lucky, the police will show up, but we can't count on it. Let's go." They lifted the frail woman together, careful not to pull at the IV line. Outside, the workers were putting up a desperate fight, swinging boards and kicking at knees, anything to keep Leon and Edward's men from advancing. Jamal and Dr. Simone slipped into the shadows, skirting a half-built corridor. Just as they neared the service entrance, a narrow gap in a chain-link fence, a shape blocked their path. They froze, heartbeats sinking in fear. It was Edward, somehow free from the brawl, cutting them off with his pistol raised. He looked at Jamal's mother, then at Jamal himself. Raindrops glistened on his suit, and the barrel of the gun wavered slightly, as if he was making a decision. "Hand her over," Edward ordered, voice low, "and leave the money. Walk away. You'll survive if you forget all this." Jamal's gut twisted. It was too late for negotiations. He clenched his jaw and stood firm, shielding his mother. He could see the struggle in Edward's eyes, some faint trace of guilt, or just frustration that things had gone so wrong. That's when the wail of distant sirens rose, faint but undeniable. Blue and red lights bounced off distant walls. Edward stiffened, glancing around. Leon shouted curses from behind a pile of twisted rebar. The workers cheered, hearts lifting at the sound of incoming law enforcement. As the sirens grow louder, Edward's eyes dart between Jamal and the approaching police lights, a silent decision forming on his tense features as he grips the stolen money tightly. Jamal felt every heartbeat echo in his skull, as if his body were a drum keeping time with the distant sirens. He stood in the dim construction site corridor, drenched in rain and sweat, holding his mother's frail form with Dr. Simone's help. The chaos behind them had intensified. Workers yelled, pipes clanged, and Leon's gang shouted curses while retreating into darker corners. Edward stood before them, pistol trembling slightly in his hand, torn between capturing the money or saving himself. The wail of police sirens grew louder, bouncing off steel beams and half-finished walls. Blue and red flashes now danced across puddles of rainwater. Edward swallowed hard, weighing his options. He raised his gun again, but hesitated. The presence of law enforcement changed the rules. Maybe he could still get away if he cut his losses. He glanced backward to where Leon's men grappled with workers, their plan unraveling piece by piece. Jamal steadied himself, determined not to back down. "Let us go," he demanded, voice low but firm. "We're leaving with or without your permission." Edward's eyes narrowed. "You're a tough kid," he said, voice colder than the rain. "But don't think for a second I won't put you down if it means saving my skin." He stepped closer, shoes squelching in the mud. Jamal clenched his jaw, ready to try something reckless if he had to. Suddenly, from the direction of the brawl, a new sound emerged. The heavy footsteps of workers banding together, led by the burly man in the hard hat, who had confronted Leon. They advanced, clutching tools and debris, determined to protect their site from these intruders. The sight of ordinary men risking themselves for a stranger's cause sparked a flicker of hope inside Jamal's chest. Edward realized he was outnumbered. He spun around, gun still raised, unsure whom to aim at first, Jamal or the workers closing in. He snarled, desperate to maintain control. But the workers moved carefully, no longer just defending themselves but forcing a wedge between the criminals and the vulnerable boy and doctor in the corner. With each passing second, the sirens drew closer. A spotlight beam cut across the chain-link fence at the site's perimeter. Police officers would be here any moment, stepping onto the muddy ground, shouting orders, demanding answers. Edward's composure cracked. His eyes darted wildly, calculating escape routes. Jamal seized the moment. "We don't have to do this," he said quietly, adjusting his mother's weight in his arms. "You can run. Save yourself. Let us go. If you make trouble now, the police will catch you for sure." Edward's nostrils flared as he tried to steady the gun. He looked at Jamal's mother, an innocent victim of all this madness. He turned to Dr. Simone, who faced him with steady defiance, refusing to cower. Finally, he shot a glare at Jamal, the boy who had dared to stand up to him, to outsmart him in front of everyone. "You're all trouble," he spat, but his voice wavered. The hammering footsteps of approaching officers echoed beyond the fence. As if snapping to a decision, Edward suddenly bolted, breaking away from the corridor into the deeper shadows of the site. He vaulted over a stack of concrete blocks and disappeared behind half-finished walls, seeking a back exit or a gap in the fence. His footsteps splashed and faded into the darkness. Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The workers reached him and Dr. Simone, forming a protective circle. Leon, separated from Edward, found himself cornered by two determined men wielding metal bars. He cursed, dropped his weapon, and lunged toward the perimeter, trying to slip away. At that moment, floodlights swung overhead as the police finally arrived, guns drawn, voices amplified by radios and shouted commands. "Freeze! Police!" rang through the rainy night. Leon hesitated just long enough for one of the workers to trip him with a well-placed kick. He hit the mud hard, sputtering and cursing as officers rushed forward to cuff him. Several officers hurried toward Jamal and Dr. Simone, drawn by the flicker of movement and the sound of coughing. They found a scene of exhaustion and relief rather than violence. Dr. Simone stepped forward first. "Please help," she said, gesturing to the frail woman in Jamal's arms. "She needs urgent medical care." The officers, taken aback by the intensity of what they'd stumbled upon, quickly assessed the situation. One officer radioed for paramedics. Jamal's eyes stung with tears he refused to shed in front of so many strangers. After all the deception, the threats, and the close calls, it felt like a miracle to have legitimate help on the way. As paramedics hustled into the site, pushing a proper gurney and shining flashlights into every dark corner, Jamal felt Dr. Simone's reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did well, kid," she said softly. "You kept your mother safe when no one else would." Jamal nodded, voice tight with emotion. "I couldn't let them take her away. I couldn't lose hope, you know." In the distance, officers led Leon away in handcuffs, his face twisted in fury and regret. The workers, though shaken, exchanged relieved nods, patting each other's shoulders. They would talk about this night for a long time, how a desperate boy and his mother exposed a ring of corruption and cruelty right in their midst. A paramedic took over care of Jamal's mother, carefully transferring her to the new gurney, hooking her up to oxygen and IV fluids. Dr. Simone provided quick details about her condition and what had been done so far. The paramedic's expression was serious, but hopeful. "We can stabilize her," he said. "She'll need a hospital, the real deal this time, but we can get her there." Jamal swallowed, relief flooding through him. He glanced around the site. Edward was nowhere to be seen, presumably still fleeing through the city's backstreets. He might have escaped this night's confrontation, but his network of corruption had been exposed, and sooner or later, the truth would catch up to him as well. Now that the danger had passed, Jamal realized he was trembling. Dr. Simone gently guided him to a quieter corner, letting the paramedics work. Rain still drummed on tarps and metal, but now it felt cleansing rather than threatening. He could barely remember the exact amount of money he still had hidden away. It hardly mattered. He'd use whatever was left to get his mother the treatment she needed, this time in a legitimate hospital with no strings attached. He looked at Dr. Simone, who offered him a small, encouraging smile. "We'll make sure she gets proper care," she said, as if reading his mind. "No gangs, no fake bills, no lies, just real doctors and honest medicine." Jamal's chest tightened with gratitude. He thought of all the hurdles he'd jumped, running from bullies in the alley, trying to buy meds from a suspicious clinic, facing ambushes in the pharmacy, and ultimately ending up in this muddy construction site. He had stood up to criminals and corruption, held on to his morals, and refused to give in to despair. In the distance, the paramedics wheeled his mother toward an ambulance. Jamal followed, steps slow and steady, heart filled with a fierce protectiveness. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, he had won a kind of victory. His mother would live to see another day, to fight for her health with proper care. Dr. Simone walked beside him, and the workers parted respectfully, some even calling out encouragement. The police took statements, photographed the scene, and promised to investigate deeper into Edward's dealings. Jamal knew the city wouldn't change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, something good would come from this mess. As Jamal watches the ambulance drive away with his mother under proper medical care, he catches a glimpse of Edward slipping quietly through the distant shadows, holding what remains of the money, and realizes the final reckoning between them is yet to come. Jamal stood outside the hospital's emergency entrance, watching the ambulance that carried his mother vanish into a wash of red and white lights. A humid dawn pressed against the city's skin, washing out the grim memories of the night before. He was soaked, exhausted, and sore in every muscle, but relief coursed through him. Real doctors were now working on her, legitimate paramedics under honest lights. No crooked middlemen, no false promises. Dr. Simone had stayed by his side, talking quietly with the paramedic, and then with a police officer who took a brief statement. Once the authorities understood Jamal's role, they treated him gently. He was just a kid caught in a criminal web, desperate to save his mother. They had more urgent matters, tracking down Edward, Leon's connections, and the false charities that had disguised dirty money all along. After a few minutes, a nurse stepped out to reassure Jamal. "She's stable right now," the nurse said softly. "We're running tests and starting proper treatment. You did the right thing, bringing her here." Jamal's shoulders sagged, tears welling in his eyes as he thanked her. He rubbed at his face, hoping Dr. Simone wouldn't see him cry, but she must have known. Her hand found his shoulder, steady and warm. The police, for their part, promised to investigate further. An officer with kind eyes approached Jamal. "We've got Leon in custody," she said. "He's talking, giving us names. Your friend Edward. We think he's still out there, but not for long. Don't worry, we'll handle him." Jamal nodded, lips pressed tight. He didn't know if he should feel relief or dread. Edward had vanished into the night, still clutching some of the funds, still out there like a poisonous thorn waiting to resurface. But for now, Jamal had no energy left for vengeance. He needed to focus on his mother's recovery. They gave him a spare set of clothes from a donation closet, a simple t-shirt and track pants that felt strange but clean on his skin. He changed in a small restroom, still shaking from the ordeal. When he stepped back into the hallway, Dr. Simone and a paramedic were discussing the best specialists for his mother's condition. Jamal hovered nearby, listening anxiously. The doctor who would oversee his mother's care arrived, a middle-aged woman with a calm voice and a steady gaze. She spoke to Jamal plainly. "Your mother's lungs are weak, but we have ways to treat her. It won't be easy or cheap, but we'll work out payment plans and financial aid. This hospital is honest. We won't turn you away because of money. You have my word." Jamal's eyes filled with gratitude. He remembered the last time he tried to buy help with cash, and no questions asked. This time he'd do it right. "I still have some funds," he said. "Not a fortune, but enough to start. And if I need more time, I'll find a way, legally. I'm done with all those dirty deals." The doctor nodded and gave him a reassuring smile, then moved on to check on patients and speak with nurses. Dr. Simone turned to Jamal, relief and pride shining in her eyes. "You made it through," she said, voice hushed. "I never expected to be dragged into something like this at a construction site, but I'm glad I was there. Your courage kept your mother alive." Jamal swallowed hard. "Thank you. Without you, I wouldn't have had any hope." They stood in the quiet hallway for a moment, nurses bustling in the background, monitors beeping softly from distant rooms. The tension that had dominated every second of the last few days began to recede, replaced by a cautious hope. Jamal felt as if he were stepping into a new chapter. No longer running through dark alleys, no longer clutching envelopes of suspicious cash, just a boy trying to help his mother heal. Soon, a paramedic offered Jamal a cup of warm tea. He drank it slowly, savoring the ordinary kindness. He looked out a window into the hospital's courtyard, where early sunlight revealed weary leaves on a half-trimmed lawn. The city beyond still held dangers and secrets, but at least this place was a sanctuary. A police officer approached with a clipboard. "We'll need your official statement later," she said gently. "For now, focus on your mother. We're going to crack this case wide open. Arrests, charges, and hopefully recovery of all those laundered funds." She paused, as if considering how much to share with a kid. "And if Edward tries to interfere, we'll be ready." The mention of Edward's name made Jamal's chest tighten. He remembered Edward's change of demeanor, the cold stare, the gun raised in the rain. How could a man who once seemed so generous turn so cruel? Jamal realized he was just a pawn in Edward's scheme, but that pawn had slipped out from under his control. Dr. Simone sensed his unease. "Forget him for now," she said. "Your mother's in the right place. Concentrate on her recovery. Let the police handle the criminals." Jamal nodded, trying to heed her advice. He had bigger priorities. He asked for permission to see his mother, at least through a window or door. A nurse guided him to the ICU viewing area, where he watched doctors and specialists in pale blue scrubs moving around her bed, hooking her up to proper equipment, administering treatments he couldn't name. Her face looked drawn, but there was a steady line on the monitor showing her heartbeat, a comfort he wouldn't trade for all the money in the world. Behind him, Dr. Simone waited quietly, giving him space. He turned around after a few minutes, feeling tears on his cheeks again. She didn't comment, just offered a soft smile and a slight tilt of her head. In that silence, Jamal found strength. She had stepped up when others were too afraid, and he would never forget that. Outside the ICU, life in the hospital carried on. A janitor mopped floors, a delivery of fresh linens arrived, a tired surgeon sipped coffee. No one stared at Jamal. He was just another worried family member waiting for good news. Normalcy felt strange after such chaos, but he welcomed it. When the police officers returned, they asked a few more questions, this time more formal. Jamal answered honestly. He told them about Edward's initial generosity, the suspicious clinics, the attacks in the pharmacy, and the final confrontation at the construction site. The officers scribbled in their notepads, nodding grimly. "So Edward escaped," one officer said, meeting Jamal's eyes. "Don't worry, we have leads. He won't hide forever, and when we find him, he'll pay for what he's done. For now, concentrate on your mother. We'll keep you updated." Jamal thanked them. He let out a shaky breath. Edward's name lingered in the hallway's fluorescent light, a reminder of unfinished business. But he refused to let that darkness overshadow the moment. His mother was safe. He had allies now, honest people working to make things right. As the nurses prepared to admit him into a small waiting room, Dr. Simone excused herself to handle paperwork for the care she had provided. Jamal gave her a grateful nod. Alone, he sank into a plastic chair, every muscle aching with fatigue. He could close his eyes for just a moment, trust that he was safe here, that no one would break through the door demanding money or threatening violence. And yet, as he drifted in and out of restless thoughts, he remembered catching a distant glimpse of Edward slipping through shadows at the construction site. A man like that wouldn't give up easily. He wondered if he'd have to face Edward again, to confront the man who had tried to steal his hope. As Jamal settles into the hospital's waiting room, he can't help but recall the look on Edward's face that night, suspecting that their paths will cross again before all is truly resolved. Jamal pressed his forehead against the cool hospital window, watching morning sunlight stretch across the rooftops of Atlanta. Days had passed since that frantic night. The sounds of alarms, footsteps in puddles, and the clash of metal pipes were now distant memories. Inside these clean halls, the world was calmer. Machines hummed quietly, and nurses exchanged kind words in hushed voices. It felt like another life entirely from the one he had led in narrow streets and dark corners. His mother was improving slowly, the treatments finally taking hold. It would be a long recovery, the doctors said, but she had a real chance now. He'd watched her breathing become less labored, her fever break, her eyes flutter open for a moment and recognize him with a faint, reassuring smile. He clung to that smile. It made all he'd endured worthwhile. The hospital had arranged a payment plan. Jamal still had some legitimate money left from the envelope, even after discarding the fake bills. He'd use it wisely, honestly. No more deals with shady characters. He'd find odd jobs, seek help from local charities that weren't fronts for corruption, and maybe in time, he'd set something aside for a better future. For now, he focused on his mother's next step, a specialized doctor recommended by Dr. Simone. He'd kept in touch with Dr. Simone, who visited every day or so, always with a calming presence and encouraging words. She brought him pamphlets about community health programs, contact numbers for honest physicians who sometimes worked pro bono, especially for families in need. She never asked for anything in return. Her kindness inspired Jamal to think differently about people. Not everyone in the city's shadows wanted to take advantage of him. Some wanted to help, just because it was right. The police had made progress too. They'd charged Leon, dismantled some of the corrupt network behind the fake hospital project, and frozen suspicious bank accounts linked to Edward and his associates. Rumor had it that Edward fled the city, staying low. The officers told Jamal they were close to tracking him down. Jamal felt no burning thirst for revenge. He just wanted the man brought to justice to stop him from hurting anyone else. He visited his mother's room, pulling a chair close to her bed, holding her hand gently. She smiled weakly, trying to form words, but he hushed her, telling her to rest. He described the sunrise outside, the birds he'd seen perched on a ledge, the taste of the apple juice a nurse had given him. He avoided all mention of the danger they had faced. In time, when she was stronger, maybe he'd tell her everything. For now, it was enough that she was healing. When Dr. Simone arrived that afternoon, Jamal stepped into the hallway to talk privately. "We need a specialist," he said, recalling the card he'd found hidden in the envelope of money, an honest doctor's contact, a clue that not everything Edward touched was rotten. This name, given to him by fate in the midst of chaos, might be the key to proper long-term treatment. Dr. Simone nodded. "I've spoken with that specialist," she said. "He's willing to see your mother." I explained the situation. No insurance, limited funds, but strong determination. He agreed to help. "You'll need to arrange transportation, maybe a small deposit, but nothing like the struggles you faced before." Jamal's eyes shone with relief. "I can do that," he said. "I can find a way." He would pawn a few old items, maybe do some manual labor, talk to neighbors. People had seen the sirens, heard rumors of what happened. Perhaps they'd understand now that he was just a kid trying to save his mom. The next day, a paramedic and a staff member from the hospital helped Jamal secure a ride to the specialist's clinic. They arranged a small ambulance transfer. The community came together in small ways. One nurse waived a minor fee, a neighbor donated a few spare blankets, and Dr. Simone provided a letter explaining the mother's medical history and the emergency measures taken so far. That afternoon, before the transfer, Jamal stepped outside to feel the sun on his face. The hospital's front lawn was modest, a strip of grass with a single bench. He sat down, inhaling the crisp air. Just a short time ago, he'd been running breathless through alleyways, chased by men with knives, holding an envelope of tainted money he barely understood. Now he sat under open sky, free from those threats. The police had asked if he wanted protection or if he feared Edward's return. Jamal told them he trusted they would do their job. He couldn't live in fear. He had too much to do. Help his mother get better, maybe find a part-time job at a grocery store or a garage, something honest. He imagined going back to school after things settled, or at least studying on his own, learning skills that could lift them out of poverty. When he returned to the ward, Dr. Simone and a paramedic were finalizing details for his mother's transfer. His mother dozed lightly, her face more peaceful than it had been in weeks. Jamal approached the bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "We're almost there." He could hardly believe it. The city's cruelty had pushed him to the brink, but he'd stood firm, refusing to become just another victim. As they wheeled her bed toward the ambulance dock, Jamal walked beside them, clutching the few real bills he had left, and the all-important card with the specialist's number. He felt no shame in how little he possessed. He had proven himself. He'd kept his morality intact, refused to sink to the criminal's level, and found a way through honesty and courage. He had something priceless now. Connections to good people, a path to real healing, and a sense of self-worth. The ambulance doors opened, and with careful hands, they lifted his mother inside. Dr. Simone checked the IV line one last time, offering a smile that felt like a blessing. "You'll be fine," she said. "If you need anything, just call me." He stepped back, letting them secure his mother's stretcher. The engine hummed to life. Jamal stood on the curb, watching the vehicle carry his mother toward the care she deserved. He caught his own reflection in a glass panel, a tired, determined kid who had grown stronger through hardship, not in wealth or status, but in faith in himself and in the goodness he'd discovered, even in a world of corruption. No black car lurked at the corner now. No suspicious eyes peered from dark windows. The streets still held their troubles, but Jamal knew he could face them. He might never see Edward again, or maybe one day he'd read in a newspaper that the man had been caught. Either way, he wouldn't let those memories define him. He didn't need $1 million. He needed understanding, compassion, and honest hands reaching out to help. He'd found that in Dr. Simone, the paramedics, the honest doctors, even the workers who stood up to criminals at the construction site. He carried their kindness forward, holding it close, knowing it was worth more than any stack of bills. He never needed millions, only the right hands. Now he is more than just a lucky kid. He is a son with hope.